He wasn't supposed to hear it. Mason Reed stood frozen in his own hallway, phone still warm in his hand, the call he thought had ended playing through the speaker like a confession meant for anyone but him. Victoria's voice, the voice he had heard through every bad night, every exhausted morning, every version of his life for nearly a decade, was saying the one thing she had never once let herself say to his face. Every future I imagine, he's already in it. Every single one. If you've ever loved someone too long and too quietly to say it out loud, this story is for you. Like this video, drop your city in the comments, and let's begin. The apartment smelled like burnt toast and grape juice. That was the first thing Mason noticed when he stepped through the front door at 9:47 on a Tuesday night. The sharp, slightly sweet smell of a 6-year-old's dinner disaster that had somehow gone unaddressed since that afternoon. He dropped his keys into the ceramic bowl by the door, the one his daughter Lily had painted for him at her school art fair 2 years ago. Lopsided, mint green, with the word Dad spelled in uneven orange letters that leaned slightly to the left, like she'd started to run out of room. He loved that bowl more than most things he owned. "Lily?" He set his laptop bag against the wall and moved toward the kitchen. The light above the stove was still on, casting a warm yellow glow across the counter where a half-eaten piece of toast sat on a paper towel. Cold. Long abandoned. The grape juice was in a plastic cup with a lid on it, barely touched. He found Rosa, his neighbor's teenage daughter, who watched Lily on his late nights, curled up on the couch with her phone, earbuds in, completely oblivious. He tapped her shoulder. She nearly levitated off the cushions. "Oh, Mr. Reed, sorry, I didn't hear you. She asleep?" "Yeah, went down around 8:30. She was really good. We watched that dinosaur thing she likes. Then she just kind of passed out." Rosa was already pulling on her jacket, efficient in the way teenagers get when they sense a parent wants their space back. She asked about the toast. "I made it for a snack, but she said it tasted funny. I think I left it in too long." "It's fine." He handed her 2 folded bills from his wallet. "Thank you, Rosa." After she left, he stood in the kitchen for a moment doing nothing, just breathing. It had been a long day. A long week, really. He was a project manager at a mid-sized architecture firm downtown, the kind of job that paid well enough but extracted pieces of you slowly, meeting by meeting, revision by revision. He was good at it. He showed up, he delivered, he stayed calm when everyone else was spiraling. He was, by most measurable standards, reliable. That was what people said about Mason Reed. He's reliable. Like it was the only interesting thing about him. He checked the stove was off, poured the grape juice down the drain, and made his way down the hall to Lily's room. The door was cracked. He pushed it open quietly. She was sideways on the bed, the way she always ended up. She started the night tucked in properly and somehow migrated 45 degrees by morning, one sock on, one off, her stuffed elephant wedged under her chin. Her dark hair was fanned out across the pillow. She had her mother's nose, slightly upturned, and Mason's stubborn jaw, which he'd noticed lately with something between pride and dread because he knew exactly how much trouble that jaw could make. He stood in the doorway for longer than he needed to. 6 years old. He'd been doing this alone since she was 14 months old, since the night Danielle had sat across the kitchen table and told him, with almost clinical calm, that she wasn't built for this. For what? He'd asked. She gestured at the baby monitor on the counter, at the dishes, at him. For any of it. She'd left 2 weeks later. New city, new life, occasional birthday cards that Lily was too young to understand and Mason was too tired to explain. He wasn't bitter. Or maybe he was, somewhere underneath, but he'd buried it so deep and so long ago that it had stopped feeling like bitterness and started feeling like just the shape of his life. He pulled Lily's blanket back over her, repositioned the elephant so it wouldn't fall, and backed out of the room. In the hallway, he pulled out his phone to text Victoria. "Heading home from the office?" he typed, then changed it to, "You up?" Then deleted that too because it sounded weird at 10 o'clock on a Tuesday. He finally just typed, "Long day. Hope yours was better." He'd known Victoria Langford since they were 22 and 20 years old, respectively, sitting across from each other in a cramped study room at the university library during finals week. She'd borrowed his highlighter without asking and then had the audacity to critique his note-taking system. He told her his note-taking system was fine. She'd said, with complete seriousness that it was organizationally catastrophic. He'd laughed so hard the librarian had shushed them both. That was 9 years ago. In 9 years, Victoria had gone from sharp-tongued undergraduate with a business major and too many opinions to the CEO of Langford Consulting, a firm she'd built from a spare bedroom and a laptop into a company with 43 employees and offices in 3 cities. She was 30 years old, and she ran her business like she did everything else, with absolute precision, unexpected warmth when you least expected it, and a stubborn refusal to pretend things were fine when they weren't. She was also, by any reasonable assessment, one of the most striking people Mason knew, though he'd trained himself over the years not to linger on that thought. Victoria was plus-size and completely unapologetic about it. She wore structured blazers and silk blouses, and occasionally, on casual Saturdays, oversized sweatshirts that made her look somehow both softer and more formidable at the same time. She had natural hair she wore in a high bun most days, large dark eyes that missed absolutely nothing, and a mouth that curved into a slow, dangerous smile right before she said something you'd be thinking about for 3 days. She was his best friend, his closest person, the one he called when Lily had a fever at 2 in the morning and he was panicking over whether to take her to urgent care, and the one who sat across from him at the small table in his kitchen on Sunday mornings and argued with him about everything from city planning to whether cereal counted as a meal. He trusted her more than anyone alive. Which was why, when his phone buzzed with her name and he picked up, a little too fast if he was being honest, and said, "Hey," and she laughed and said, "I knew you'd still be awake," he felt the familiar loosening in his chest, the day unwinding a little, just from her voice. "Bad day?" she asked. "Middling." He moved into the living room and lowered himself onto the couch. Hendricks pushed back the Creston proposal again. Third time. "That man is a professional obstacle. He's the client. That doesn't make him less of an obstacle." He could hear her moving around Chasam, the sound of heels on hardwood, a door opening. "Hold on, I'm just getting inside." "Late night at the office?" "Dinner with the Mercer people," which was actually fine until their VP decided to share his thoughts on women in executive roles, at which point I smiled so hard my face hurt, and then excused myself to the restroom where I conducted a 15-second internal monologue. Mason smiled despite himself. "What did the monologue say?" "Mostly unrepeatable things, but I came back out and closed the deal, so..." A pause, the sound of keys dropping. "How's my girl?" His girl. That was how Victoria always referred to Lily. Not in a presumptuous way, nothing that overstepped, but with genuine warmth, like Lily was a fact she was personally fond of. And Lily was fond of her back, in the uncomplicated, undisguised way children have when they simply decide they like someone. Victoria was the person Lily requested at birthday parties, and the person she showed her drawings to first, and the person she fell asleep on at movie nights without any ceremony whatsoever. "Grape juice incident," Mason said. "Mostly fine, asleep sideways." "Naturally. She asked me last week why you don't live here." A small beat of silence. Not long, just enough to notice. "What did you tell her?" "That you have your own apartment. She said that was a terrible reason." Victoria laughed, but it came out a fraction uneven. "Smart kid. Too smart." They talked for another 15 minutes. Easy, comfortable, the kind of conversation they'd been having for years that required no effort and no performance. He told her about the Creston situation. She told him about a junior consultant who'd submitted a report using the wrong template, which would have been forgivable except that it was the same template she'd corrected twice. He made her laugh about the toast. She made him feel better about the week. At some point, she said, "Okay, I should go. I've got Diane coming over." Diane was her roommate and oldest college friend, a loud, funny, aggressively honest woman who worked in hospital administration and had strong opinions about reality television and absolutely nothing else. "Tell her I said hi," Mason said. "She'll say something rude back." "I know. That's why I do it." "Night, Mason. Night." He pulled the phone away from his ear. The call had ended. That was what he thought. He looked at the screen and saw that it hadn't ended. The call was still active. The timer was still running. He brought the phone back to his ear. "I don't know, Diane. I can't explain it." He froze. Victoria's voice, but different. Not the easy, composed version she wore in conversation. Something under that, something rawer, the voice she only used when she thought no one was listening. It's not like I planned any of this. You don't plan this. You don't wake up one day and decide that the one person you can't imagine your life without is also the one person you absolutely cannot say that to. Mason sat very still. He didn't breathe. Every time I think about just saying it, I think about losing him, losing Lily, losing Sunday mornings. And I would rather have that and nothing else than say something and blow the whole thing apart. He should have hung up. He knew that even in the moment, he knew it was wrong, that he was hearing something he had no right to hear, that the ethical, decent thing to do was to end the call. He didn't end the call. You've been saying that for 3 years, Diane's voice came through, muffled but clear. At what point does protecting the friendship become just being scared? Those aren't mutually exclusive. Vic, I love him. The words came out flat and exhausted, like she'd been carrying them for so long they'd worn grooves into her. I love him, and I have loved him for years, and every future I imagine, and every single one, Diane. He's already there. Him and Lily and Sunday mornings and all of it. It's been like that for so long, I don't even remember what it felt like before. She laughed, but it had nothing funny in it. But he doesn't see me that way. He can't. I'm his best friend. I'm the reliable one. I'm the one he calls because he needs someone, and I'm always there. That's what I am to him. Diane said something Mason couldn't quite catch, something low and insistent. It doesn't matter, Victoria said. It doesn't matter what I want. The life he's built, the life he's made for Lily, that matters. Blowing that up because I have feelings I should have handled years ago, that's not something I'm willing to do. Another pause. I just needed to say it out loud. Once. To someone. Because keeping it in the same box every single day is... Her voice fractured, just slightly. Just for a second. It gets heavy, is all. The call ended. This time for real. Mason sat without moving for a very long time. Outside, a car passed on the street below. Somewhere down the hall, Lily shifted in her sleep. He heard the small creak of her mattress. The apartment was quiet around him in the particular way it got late at night, full of its own small sounds and his own large thoughts. Every future, I imagine. He's already there. He put his phone face down on the cushion beside him and pressed his hands over his eyes. He was not the kind of man who fell apart. He was reliable, steady, the kind of person other people leaned on because he didn't lean back. That had been his whole architecture for years. Build something stable. Give Lily something stable. Don't let anything tilt the foundation. But there was a weight sitting in his chest now that felt nothing like stability. It felt like something coming loose, like a nail that had been holding for years under quiet pressure, finally giving way. He thought about the first time Victoria had come to the apartment after Lily was born, not when Danielle was still there, but after, when it was just him and the baby, and the particular terror of being the only adult in a small space with a 14-month-old who didn't understand yet that her mother wasn't coming back. Victoria had shown up with takeout and a truly absurd number of baby wipes because she'd read somewhere that you could never have too many. She'd sat on the floor with Lily for 2 hours, making faces, getting covered in whatever Lily was eating, laughing at herself with zero self-consciousness. He thought about her at Lily's 3rd birthday, how she'd organized the whole party because Mason had been knee-deep in a work crisis, and how she'd stayed after and cleaned up and then made him eat dinner because he'd forgotten to, and then sat with him while he quietly admitted he'd cried in the bathroom earlier that afternoon, overwhelmed, and she hadn't made a single joke, just sat beside him. Let it be what it was. He thought about the argument they'd had 2 years ago, a real one, the kind that came from a real place. He'd been distant for weeks, and she'd finally called him on it, direct and unflinching. And he'd said something he immediately regretted, something dismissive and sharp. And she'd gotten quiet in a way that was worse than yelling. And then she'd said, "I'm not asking you to be fine. I'm asking you to stop disappearing." They hadn't spoken for 4 days. 4 days that had felt wrong in every hour of them. And then he'd called her and she'd picked up on the second ring, and neither of them had mentioned it again. He thought about every time he'd met a woman, at work, through friends, the 2 or 3 attempts at something like dating he'd made over the years. and how each one had felt at some point slightly off, slightly wrong, in a way he'd never been able to name. Not because they weren't good people, because they weren't her. He'd never let himself finish that thought. He'd cut it off every time, filed it under unrealistic, dangerous, stop it, and moved on. Every future I imagine, he's already there. He sat in the dark for a long time. Then he got up, checked the locks, turned off the kitchen light, and walked back to the hallway. He paused outside Lily's room again. She hadn't moved. The elephant was still under her chin. He stood there looking at his daughter, the thing he had built his whole careful life around, and felt the ground shift, just slightly, under everything. He didn't sleep well. That wasn't unusual exactly. He was a light sleeper, had been since Lily was an infant, and he'd trained himself to wake at small sounds. But this was different. This was lying in the dark with his eyes open, the ceiling looking back at him, that voice looping through his head with a persistence that felt almost cruel. It gets heavy, is all. He thought about calling her. Twice. The first time he picked up his phone and looked at her name in his contacts, Vic, and put it back down because it was after midnight and he didn't know what he would say. The second time he got as far as pulling up the call screen before he caught himself and thought, and then what? Say he'd heard? Say he'd been listening? She'd be mortified. The confession she'd made in what she thought was privacy. She'd made it that way for a reason. He put the phone on the nightstand and stared at the ceiling some more. What he kept coming back to, what kept pulling him back like a current, was not just what she'd said, but the exhaustion in it. 3 years, Diane had said. You've been saying this for 3 years. And Victoria hadn't denied it. She'd just said, I've been carrying it. 3 years. He thought back over the last 3 years and started doing the uncomfortable work of actually looking at things he'd trained himself not to look at. The way he noticed when she walked into a room. Not in the way you notice a friend, more like recalibration, like something in him adjusted. The way he'd felt, briefly and sharply, that one time she'd mentioned going on a date with someone from her professional network. He'd kept his face neutral. He'd asked casual questions. He'd thought about it for 2 weeks. The way Sunday mornings, coffee, bad television, Lily between them on the couch or drawing at the coffee table, the particular unhurried ease of those hours, had become the thing he looked forward to most in a given week. Not as the collective whole, specifically with her. He'd built a story. The story was, Victoria is my best friend, my support system, the most important person in my life after Lily, and that is enough. That is a lot. Don't ruin it. It was a good story. It was a functional story. But lying in the dark at 12:40 in the morning, he couldn't quite make it hold the same shape it had at noon. He was making coffee at 7 the next morning when Lily appeared in the kitchen doorway in her pajamas, her hair doing something architecturally impressive, the elephant tucked under her arm. You look tired, she said. Thank you, Lily. Were you up late? A little. She climbed up onto one of the kitchen stools with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been doing it for years. She was small for her age. He worried about this periodically, had taken her to the pediatrician twice about it, been reassured twice, but what she lacked in size she made up for in presence. She had an unusual stillness for a 6-year-old, a way of watching things carefully before she spoke. Can we have waffles? We can have cereal. Waffles are better. Waffles take 20 minutes. She considered this. That's okay. I'm not that hungry yet. He stood there for a moment, spatula in hand, looking at his daughter. She was already reaching across the counter for the box of crayons she'd left there yesterday, pulling out a piece of paper, settling in with the particular self-contained focus she had when she was drawing. This was the thing. This was what he'd built. This small, stubborn, beautiful life with its cereal negotiations and lopsided bowls and grape juice incidents and the elephant that went everywhere. This was what he'd protected with every cautious decision, every controlled feeling, every boundary he'd quietly maintained. He didn't regret any of it. But he wondered, for the first time in a long time, what it would look like if Victoria was in this kitchen too. Not visiting, just here. He caught the thought, set it aside, made waffles. He texted her at 10 that morning after he dropped Lily at school. You around this afternoon? Wanted to catch up. She responded within 10 minutes. Meetings till 2. Park after? The one by the fountain. He sat with his phone in the car outside the school after Lily had run inside with her backpack bouncing. Park after meant a lot of things. It meant the bench near the eastern fountain they'd claimed by habit, the one under the tree that provided questionable but technically present shade. It meant coffee from the cart nearby that he always overpaid for and she always criticized for being overpriced despite also ordering from it every time. It meant an hour of the easy company that had become, without either of them formally deciding it, essential. "Sounds good," he typed. He drove to work. He accomplished very little. She was already at the bench when he got there at 2:15, coat folded over the arm beside her, a coffee in each hand. Her hair was in its usual high bun, slightly loosened from the day. She was wearing a gray blazer over a cream blouse, her work clothes still on, which meant the meetings had run long, which they always did. She handed him a coffee when he sat down. "Overpriced," he said. "Enormously," she agreed. "I got you the medium. You usually get me the large." The large would have meant talking to Eduardo for an additional 45 seconds, and I had a meeting run to 2:15. "Fair." They sat for a moment. The fountain moved somewhere nearby. Two kids were feeding something to the birds at the path's edge, their mother watching with the watchful, tired eyes of someone who's learned to choose their battles. Mason held his coffee in both hands and looked at the path ahead. He'd spent the morning constructing several versions of this conversation. None of them felt right. The honest version felt like detonation. The casual version felt like cowardice. He'd settled, somewhere between his third and fourth failed attempt at the Creston proposal, on something in the middle. Truth. But the surface of it. Just enough. "I heard your call last night," he said. The words came out quieter than he'd intended. Not an accusation, just a statement. Beside him, Victoria went very still. Not the kind of still that means nothing. The specific kind that means everything has just recalibrated at once. "I thought it had ended," he said. "I wasn't listening on purpose, and I should have hung up. I know that. I stayed on longer than I should have, and that's on me, and I'm sorry for it." He could feel her not looking at him. He wasn't looking at her either. "How long did you—" Her voice was careful, controlled, but barely. "What did you hear?" "Enough." A long pause. "Mason, you don't have to explain anything," he said. "I'm not asking you to. He stopped. Tried again. "I couldn't sit with it and act like I didn't know. That felt dishonest. And we don't do that. The fountain, the birds, the mother deciding that yes, this was worth intervening in after all." "I'm embarrassed," Victoria said, finally, at a volume that suggested it cost her something. "I want you to know that. Whatever you think you heard, I don't think I heard anything. I know what I heard." She exhaled, slow. "Okay." A pause. "Okay." Another long quiet. "How long?" he asked. She didn't pretend not to understand the question. "A while." She turned the coffee cup in her hands. "Longer than I'd like to admit to you right now, honestly." She laughed once, brief and hollow. "This is mortifying." "It's not." "Easy for you to say." "Victoria." He said her name the way he rarely did, with full weight, without the shorthand. She turned finally and looked at him. Her eyes were steady but working hard to be. "It's not mortifying. None of it is." She watched his face. "I need to say something," he said. "And I need you to let me finish before you, Mason, before you redirect or deflect, or let me finish." She closed her mouth. "I've been building reasons why not for years. Good reasons. Real reasons. Lily, stability, the friendship, all of it. I believe them. I still believe some of them." He turned the cup in his hands. "But last night I lay awake and I did something I don't usually let myself do. I actually looked at it. What I've been not looking at." She waited. "You are the person," he said. "That's the whole sentence. You are the person, and I've been standing next to that fact with my back turned to it for as long as I can remember. And He paused. "I don't think I can do that anymore." The fountain moved. The birds scattered briefly from the path and resettled. Victoria looked at him for a long moment. Something in her face shifted. Not falling apart, but releasing. like a thing held too long under pressure, finding a way to breathe. "You heard me say I was afraid of losing you," she said. "I heard that. That's still true. I know. I'm not going to just—" She pressed her lips together. "I'm not going to pretend that one conversation fixes the part where I've been terrified for years. That doesn't just go away. I'm not asking it to. And Lily loves you," he said. "You already know that. She told you to move in. She's 6 and she's already ahead of both of us." Something broke loose in her expression, not quite a smile, something more complicated and more honest than that. "She is ahead of both of us," Victoria said. "Significantly." A pause. "I'm scared," she said. The words came out plainly, without decoration. "I need you to know that I'm scared. Not of you. Of it not working. And then what? Of what we'd lose." "Me too," he said. "I've been scared of that for as long as I've known I had something to be scared about." She looked at the fountain. "What do we do with that?" He thought about it. Not a quick answer. An actual answer. "I think," he said slowly, "that we've been protecting the friendship from something that was already part of the friendship. And I don't know exactly what comes next, but I think we start with telling the truth instead of managing it." She sat with that. Then, quietly, without fanfare, without the relief of a clean resolution, she reached over and put her hand over his where it rested on the bench, not holding it, just placing it there, warm and present and careful. "Okay," she said. It was not the end of anything. Both of them knew that. It was the beginning of a longer, harder, more important conversation. The kind that doesn't resolve in an afternoon on a bench, the kind that gets interrupted by work and Lily's school schedule and old fears that don't evacuate just because you name them. But it was the first true thing. The first one neither of them walked away from. Mason looked down at her hand on his, then at the path ahead, then, briefly, at the side of her face while she looked at the water. He thought about Sunday mornings. He thought about waffles. He thought, "I've been standing next to this with my back turned." And he thought about how much had gone by while he was turned away. And he thought that was enough. That was finally enough. He didn't say any of that. He turned his hand over slowly and held hers back. Neither of them said anything for a while after that. The fountain moved. The afternoon moved. The two of them sat on the bench under the tree, holding on carefully to the thing they'd been afraid to hold. And for the first time in years, neither of them let go. They didn't talk about it again that night. That was the strange part, that after everything, after the bench and the fountain and the careful weight of her hand on his, they walked back to the coffee cart, ordered refills they didn't need, and spent the next 40 minutes talking about her junior consultant's template problem and whether the city should have repaved that particular stretch of the park path 2 years ago. Normal things. The kind of conversation that required nothing from either of them except presence. It felt almost like nothing had happened, except that it had, and both of them knew it. And every so often, in the gaps between sentences, Mason would catch something in Victoria's expression. Not quite discomfort, not quite ease, something in between. And he knew she was doing the same thing he was, turning it over, trying to figure out what shape this new thing was, now that it was out in the air between them instead of locked away separately where it couldn't cause trouble. He picked Lily up from school at 4:30. She got in the car and immediately began a detailed account of something that had happened at lunch involving a boy named Derek and a misunderstanding about whose juice box was whose. And Mason listened and asked the right questions and laughed in the right places. By the time they got home, he'd managed to feel like something close to himself again. Almost. He made pasta for dinner. Lily drew at the table while the water boiled. At some point she said, without looking up from her drawing, "Is Victoria coming over this weekend?" Mason stirred the pot. "I'm not sure. Why?" "I want to show her my new drawing. It's a horse, but the legs are wrong." She held it up. The horse did in fact have legs that were doing something anatomically ambitious. "I think I need help. I don't think Victoria knows more about horse legs than you do. She knows more about everything than everyone." He set the spoon down and looked at his daughter. She'd already gone back to drawing, correcting the legs with a confidence that suggested she'd already solved the problem on her own and had just needed to say it out loud. 6 years old and already working through things by talking about them. He thought, she gets that from you. He didn't know exactly where the thought came from, only that it was true, and that he'd been watching it happen for years without naming it. The way Lily had picked up Victoria's habit of stating the problem plainly instead of circling around it. The way she'd started recently, ending arguments with a flat that doesn't make sense that was so Victoria it sometimes stopped Mason mid-sentence. Influence was a quiet thing. It happened in the small hours, the ordinary afternoons, the Tuesday dinners. You didn't notice until one day you looked at your kid holding a drawing with wrong horse legs and thought, she already sounds like the person I've been too afraid to keep. Victoria, for her part, drove home from the park feeling like someone had rearranged all the furniture inside her while she wasn't looking. Everything was still technically there. Nothing was missing, but nothing was where she'd left it either, and moving through the space required more attention than it used to. She made it back to her apartment, dropped her bag, and stood in her kitchen for a full minute doing nothing. Diane was out. Thank everything. She did not have the bandwidth for Diane right now. For the eyebrow, the pointed question, the relentless emotional accuracy that made her a good friend and occasionally an exhausting one. Victoria poured a glass of water and stood at the counter drinking it and tried to think clearly. He knew. That was the fact she kept bumping into. He knew, and he hadn't stepped back. He hadn't gone quiet and careful the way people do when they're about to manage you out of a situation. He'd said something. He'd sat next to her on a bench in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon and said, "You are the person," and then held her hand. And now she was standing in her kitchen at 5:30, feeling like the ground was made of something slightly different than she'd always assumed. She was glad. She was also terrified. Both of those things were completely real, and she wasn't going to pretend otherwise. The fear wasn't dramatic. It wasn't the kind of fear you could name in a moment and be done with. It was quieter and more specific than that. The fear of someone who had already decided years ago what she was willing to lose and what she wasn't. She'd made her calculations. She'd accepted them. And now the calculations were wrong, or at least incomplete, and she didn't know yet what came after that. She set down the glass and picked up her phone. She looked at his name in her contacts. She put the phone face down on the counter and went to wash her face. 3 days passed. They texted. Nothing unusual, nothing that referenced the bench. He sent her a photo of Lily's corrected horse drawing with the caption, "She fixed the legs." She sent back the anatomical accuracy as genuinely impressive. They made vague plans for Sunday that neither of them confirmed or canceled, existing in a kind of tentative orbit that felt new and slightly strange and also, Mason had to admit, not entirely bad. There was something different about talking to her now, not worse, not easier exactly, just different in a way he was still figuring out, like listening to a song you've heard 100 times and suddenly noticing a note that had been there all along. He caught himself doing things he hadn't consciously done before, noticing when she said something that made him laugh more than it should have, noticing when she'd obviously had a bad day from the 3-word text she sent instead of her usual paragraph-length ones, noticing in a sharper, more deliberate way that he'd stopped letting himself deflect from. It was uncomfortable. He hadn't promised himself it wouldn't be. On Thursday, they ended up at the same coffee place near his office for a lunch neither of them had specifically planned. She'd been there for a client meeting that ran short. He'd come to buy an overpriced sandwich and think. They saw each other through the window at approximately the same moment. She'd made the particular face she made when something was simultaneously inconvenient and unsurprising. He'd gone in. They'd taken the corner table, the small one near the window that was really designed for one person, but they'd been sharing variations of it for years. Her laptop was open. He put his bag on the chair and ordered at the counter and came back and sat down and said, "You could have pretended not to see me." "I thought about it," she said, not looking up from her screen. "What stopped you?" "Basic human decency." She typed something. "And you'd already made eye contact." He unwrapped his sandwich. She kept typing for another 30 seconds before closing the laptop with the resigned air of someone accepting an interruption they actually wanted. "How's Creston?" "Still a disaster. Hendricks approved the revised concept this morning and then by afternoon had somehow convinced himself he'd asked for something else." Classic. His assistant actually pulled up the email chain to show him, in the meeting, in front of everyone. He paused. "I felt bad for exactly 2 seconds, and then I felt vindicated." "That's appropriate." Thank you. She picked up her coffee. He ate his sandwich. Outside, a group of office workers passed in a cluster, someone in the middle talking too loudly on their phone about a pipeline. How's the Mercer account? He asked. Fine. Moving. The VP who made the comment at dinner sent an email this morning that was technically an apology. Technically. Technically, as in it contained the word sorry and then immediately explained why he wasn't entirely wrong. She looked at the street. I've started cataloging these. The qualified apology, the preemptive redirect, the I didn't mean it that way where the that way is doing a lot of structural work. You should publish it. I should. A field guide to saying sorry without meaning it. I'd write it in a week. I'd buy it. You'd get it for free. I'd make you proofread it. He smiled. She did too. Briefly, the real kind. Not the composed professional version, but the one that appeared when her guard was slightly down and something actually landed. Then they both looked at their respective things, sandwich, coffee, and the easy moment passed into something slightly more weighted. Are we okay? She said eventually. She didn't look at him when she asked it. She was turning the coffee cup. He thought about the question. Not what he wanted to say. What was actually true. I think we're in the middle of something, he said. But yeah, we're okay. She considered that. The middle of something is not the same as okay. No, but it's not okay either. She looked at him then. Her eyes did the thing they did sometimes. That careful, direct assessment that felt like being read in a way that might or might not be comfortable. He held it. I keep waiting for it to feel weird, she said. Between us. Does it? She thought. No, that's the part I can't figure out. It doesn't feel weird, it just feels... She stopped. Heavier, he said. Heavier. Yes. She exhaled. Like I'm paying more attention to things I used to let go by without noticing. Same. She set the cup down. Something in her shoulder shifted slightly. Not relaxing exactly, but settling. I don't know how to do this, she said. I want you to know that. I don't mean this. I mean, she gestured between them. Navigating whatever this is while also not torpedoing everything. I don't have a framework. You always have a framework. I really don't for this. I've checked. He thought about that. Maybe we don't need one yet. That's very uncomfortable for me. I know. She gave him a look that was equal parts exasperated and genuine, and something else he'd been noticing more carefully in the last 3 days. You're handling this very calmly, she said. I'm not calm. I'm just quiet about it. What are you not calm about? He was quiet for a moment. On the street, a delivery truck was maneuvering into a spot that was clearly too small for it. Both of them watched it fail and try again. I keep thinking about Lily, he said. Victoria waited. Not in a bad way. Not like she's a reason to pull back or slow down. But she's already attached to you. She already has you in her life in a way that's real and consistent and meaningful. And he paused. If this goes badly, if we try something and it doesn't work and we lose each other, she loses you too. He turned his coffee cup. She doesn't get a choice in that, and that's heavy, Victoria said quietly. Yeah. She was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the truck finally made it into the spot with about 4 inches to spare. I think about that too, she said. For what it's worth. She looked at him. I think about all of it. I think about what it means to be in someone's life, in Lily's life, in a way that's not just weekend visits and school pickups. What it would actually mean to be there, all the way. What I'd be committing to. And it doesn't scare me the way you might think it would. She looked down. The actual day-to-day of it, the hard version, She made a small, slightly helpless gesture. Grape juice incident. He stared at her. The grape juice. It's an example, she said, slightly defensive. I'm using it as a metaphor. For what? For the real parts, the not curated parts. I'm not scared of that. She looked at him. I'm scared of wanting all of it and being wrong about whether I'm ready for it. Those are different things. He sat with that. He thought about the version of this he'd been carrying in some locked-off corner of his chest. Not a fully formed thought, more like a shape he hadn't turned toward. The version where Sunday mornings weren't just Sunday mornings, where the person who already knew where he kept the spare key and already knew Lily's comfort routines and already knew exactly when he was having a bad week by the particular way he texted. Where that person was just there, all the way there. He'd been so careful not to want it. I made a lot of decisions after Danielle left, he said, about what I was and wasn't going to risk, what I was and wasn't going to let in. He looked at the table. Those decisions made sense at the time. They protected something real. I know, she said. I watched you make them. They also... He stopped. I think I made some of them past their usefulness, and just kept holding them because they were familiar. Victoria didn't say anything right away. She was looking at him in that full, careful way. For what it's worth, she said, the whole time you were making those decisions, you were still one of the best people I knew. Not because you were guarded, despite it. She paused. I want you to know that. Not because it changes anything, just because it's true. He looked at her for a long moment. You're better at this than I am, he said. At what? At saying the true thing plainly. I have a 20-year head start on being deeply uncomfortable with this particular situation, she said. I had to get good at talking around it. He laughed. A real one. Short and surprised. She smiled at the table. They sat there a while longer. His sandwich finished, her coffee cooling, neither of them in any particular hurry to move. The afternoon light was doing something pleasant through the coffee shop window that neither of them commented on. Outside, the delivery truck driver had gotten out and appeared to be on a phone call, gesturing at the too small space with the energy of someone making a very strong case about something. Sunday, Victoria said eventually, packing up her laptop. Sunday, he confirmed. It wasn't a plan exactly. It wasn't a declaration. It was what it always was. A standing fact. A routine that had been part of both their lives so long it had stopped needing to be proposed. But it felt different as she said it now. Not heavier, just more deliberate, like something they were both choosing, consciously, on purpose. She stood, shouldered her bag, and then paused. She looked at him. Mason? Yeah. Thank you for not making it weird. I'm sure I'll make it weird eventually. Probably, she said. But not today. She left. He watched her go through the window, the way she moved with that particular purposeful ease, the slight turn of her head as she checked her phone before she rounded the corner and was gone. He sat with the last of his cold coffee and the quiet that came after. He thought about 9 years, the whole long line of them, every version of what they'd been to each other, every way the thing between them had shifted shape without either of them formally acknowledging it. He thought about all the things said in coffee shops and park benches and Sunday mornings that had added up to something that didn't have a category yet. He was a man who liked categories. He liked knowing where things went. He'd built an entire life on knowing where things went. This thing didn't have a place yet. He was less afraid of that than he thought he'd be. He put on his coat, left a tip, stepped back out into the afternoon. Sunday came the way Sundays do. Not dramatically, but with a kind of settled weight. Lily had been up since 6:30, which Mason knew because he'd been lying awake since 6:15, thinking, and Lily appeared in his doorway at 6:31 with the elephant and the information that she was hungry, and also that she had been thinking about horses again. He made waffles. Victoria texted at 8:47, bringing the thing from that coffee place you pretend you don't love. He typed back, I've never pretended. You've definitely pretended. I tolerate it. You ask for extra of the thing. He put the phone in his pocket and finished the batter. When she knocked at 9:15, Lily was already at the door before Mason reached the hall. She yanked it open with both hands and stood there looking up at Victoria with the straightforward appraisal of someone who had been anticipating this. I fixed the horse legs, she announced. Victoria stepped inside, coffee carrier in one hand, the white bakery bag in the other. She looked down at Lily with complete seriousness. Show me. Lily turned and ran for the kitchen. Victoria followed, and by the time Mason came around the corner, Victoria was sitting at the kitchen table with the drawing held at arm's length, examining it with the concentration she usually applied to quarterly reports. The legs are correct, she said. The tail is slightly aggressive. Lily frowned. What does aggressive mean? Enthusiastic, Mason said. Right, Victoria agreed. Enthusiastically large. Lily took the drawing back and looked at the tail. I like it. It's working, Victoria said seriously. Keep it. Lily took the drawing and disappeared toward her room with the satisfied air of someone whose work had been properly reviewed. Victoria set the bakery bag on the table, caught Mason's eye across the kitchen, and something moved between them, quick and quiet and complicated. Before Lily came running back for the pastry, she'd already spotted. Sunday moved the way it always did. Except it didn't, quite. But they let it. That was the thing. They let the ordinary keep being ordinary. And underneath it something else was settling into place, the way groundwater moves, slow, invisible, altering the landscape before anything on the surface shows. The wedding invitation had been sitting on Victoria's kitchen counter for 3 weeks. She'd propped it against the fruit bowl. Ivory cardstock, gold lettering, the kind of formal weight that meant someone had spent real money on paper, and walked past it every morning without making a decision. Her cousin Renata was getting married to a man named Paul, who sold commercial real estate and made Renata laugh in a way nobody else ever had, and Victoria was genuinely happy for them. That part was uncomplicated. The complicated part was the +1 line. She'd mentioned it to Mason on a Wednesday, casually, the kind of mention designed to sound like it required nothing from either of them. Renata's wedding is the 14th. I might need a human shield against my Aunt Carol, who will definitely ask about my relationship status within 4 minutes of arrival. She'd said it lightly, like a joke, because it was easier that way. Mason had said, without hesitating, I'll go. She'd looked at him. You don't have to. I know. He'd already gone back to whatever he was reading. What time? That was 6 days ago. They hadn't discussed it further. Rosa was confirmed for Lily. Victoria had bought a dress. Mason had, she assumed, located a suit somewhere in the back of his closet where functional adult clothing went to wait between uses. She had not let herself think too hard about what it meant that the +1 question had resolved itself before she'd finished the sentence. He picked her up at 6. She was ready at 5:50 and spent 10 minutes not standing by the window before standing by the window anyway. When his car pulled up, she counted to 30 before going downstairs, which felt like an embarrassing thing to do, but she did it regardless. He was leaning against the passenger side door when she came out, jacket on, tie slightly off-center the way his ties always were, because he never fully committed to the last half-inch of tightening. He looked up when he heard the door. She watched him take her in. Not a slow look, not performed, just the natural, unguarded second that happened before people remembered to be composed. His expression didn't change dramatically, but something in it settled differently. The tie, she said, reaching him. I know. He stood still while she straightened it, which she'd done before at other events over the years. It had never felt like anything other than the practical thing it was. Tonight her fingers were slightly more deliberate about it, and they both knew it, and neither of them said so. Better, she said. Thank you. They got in the car. Boss. The venue was a converted estate about 40 minutes outside the city, the kind of place with original stone walls and ivy that people spent enormous amounts of money renting for exactly one evening. The main hall had been dressed in cream and deep green, candles on every surface, the whole thing warm and slightly amber lit in a way that made everyone look more beautiful than they usually did. Victoria had been to enough events in her professional life that venues didn't impress her, but she noticed, walking in beside Mason, the particular effect of candlelight at close range, and made a conscious decision not to read into it. Her Aunt Carol found them within 6 minutes. Victoria had given herself 4, so this felt like a minor victory. Carol was 63, sharp-eyed, affectionate in the specific way of women who love you and also have opinions about every choice you've ever made. She came at them from the left near the welcome table, both arms already extended. Victoria. Air kisses. Then she turned and looked at Mason with the frank assessment of someone who has been waiting to do exactly this. And who is this? Mason Reed, he said, extending his hand. Victoria's friend, Victoria said. Friend, Mason agreed. A beat. Close friend. Carol looked between them the way people look at a painting they're trying to decide if they like. Close friend, she repeated. Mason, this is my Aunt Carol. What do you do, Mason? Project manager, architecture firm downtown? Carol's eyes moved to Victoria's. He has a good handshake. I'll tell him you said so. I'm right here, Mason said. I know, Carol said pleasantly. She patted his arm and moved away toward the bar with the smooth exit of someone who had extracted what they came for. Mason watched her go. She's terrifying. She voted for you before you said a word, Victoria said. That's basically a standing ovation from Carol. How do you know? The arm pat. She only does that with people she's already decided she likes. Victoria accepted 2 glasses of wine from a passing tray and handed one to him. If she hadn't liked you, she would have said something complimentary that was somehow also slightly insulting and then asked me about work. He considered that. I'll take it. You should. Renata's ceremony was short and sincere in the way the best ones are. 22 minutes, personal vows that made half the front row cry, a ring exchange that involved a dropped ring, and a genuine laugh from everyone including the couple. Paul caught it on the second bounce, and the whole room exhaled with relief and delight. Mason leaned slightly toward Victoria during the ring recovery. That's going to be the story they tell forever. Absolutely, she said quietly. They'll be dining out on that for 30 years. Good. She looked at him. Good? The best couples always have something like that, something that went wrong in a way that was actually right. He was watching the couple, not her. Something real. She turned back to the ceremony. Renata and Paul were laughing, the officiant included, the whole moment loose and human and nothing like the polished choreography these things were supposed to be. Victoria thought, something real. She held that thought and said nothing. Dinner was round tables of 8, the kind of seating arrangement designed to produce conversation by proximity. They were seated with 2 couples from Renata's work, an older man named Gerald, who was apparently Paul's former professor, and a woman named Simone who seemed to know everyone and forget no one. Mason handled it the way he handled most social situations, quietly, attentively, speaking when he had something to say, and listening without the restless performance of someone waiting for their next turn. Victoria had always appreciated this about him. Plenty of the men she knew in professional settings filled every silence like it was a threat. Mason treated silence like information. Simone, who was seated on his other side, had apparently decided within 10 minutes that he was worth talking to. Victoria watched from the corner of her eye as they talked. Something about the city's development patterns, then about schools, then about Lily. Because Mason always talked about Lily when the conversation turned to anything real. She noticed the way his whole register shifted when he mentioned his daughter. Not softer exactly, but more grounded, more certain. Like whatever else was complicated, that part wasn't. At some point, Simone looked across Mason at Victoria and said, "How long have you 2 been together?" Victoria opened her mouth. "Long time," Mason said, not missing a beat. Then he glanced at Victoria, something behind his eyes that was not quite mischief and not quite honesty, and was probably both at once. "Long time coming, I mean." Simone smiled like she understood something they hadn't said. "I can always tell." Victoria took a sip of wine and looked at the table setting and decided that was enough of that particular thread. But she felt it. The way his answer had landed, the ease of it, which was worse somehow than awkwardness would have been. Because awkwardness would have meant it wasn't natural yet, and the ease meant it already was. Long time coming. The dancing started at 9. The band was good. Older musicians who played with the competence of people who had done this hundreds of times and still meant it. They opened with something upbeat, got the obligatory group dances out of the way, and by 9:30 had moved into the slower rotation that cleared the floor of everyone who'd only been there for the fun parts. Mason and Victoria had migrated to the edge of the room, near the open French doors that led to the garden. The night air was coming in, cool and slightly floral from whatever was blooming outside. Victoria had slipped off her heels 20 minutes ago and was holding them in one hand, her feet on the warm stone floor. They'd been standing near each other for a while without a specific reason to stand near each other, which was its own kind of reason. "Your cousin looks happy," Mason said. Victoria watched Renata and Paul on the floor, Renata's head against his shoulder, Paul's chin resting on top of it, both of them barely moving. She does. You like him? Paul? Yeah. He's decent. He doesn't try to be impressive, which is... She paused. That matters more than most people think. It does, Mason said. The song moved. Someone near them laughed at something. The candles on the nearest table had burned low, the wax running in slow trails down the holders. We should dance, Mason said. She looked at him. At a wedding, he said. It's a normal thing to do at a wedding. I know what dancing is, Mason. You're looking at me like I suggested something unusual. I'm looking at you like... She stopped. Fine. She set her heels under the edge of the table and followed him onto the floor. It was not a complicated dance. The band was playing something slow, and the floor was half full, and nobody was watching them specifically. He put one hand at her waist, and she put one at his shoulder, and they found the rhythm without difficulty because they'd been navigating each other's physical space for 9 years and knew it without thinking. For the first few measures, neither of them said anything. This was the thing about already knowing someone. You didn't have to feel it. You could just be inside the moment without narrating it. The band played. The room moved slowly around them. She could feel the warmth of his hand through the fabric at her waist, the slight adjustment he made when she shifted, the way his shoulders weren't quite relaxed but were trying to be. You're thinking, she said. I'm always thinking. About? He was quiet long enough that she looked up at him. He was looking somewhere past her shoulder, the way he did when he was working something out. About how many times I've been in a room with you, he said, and let myself believe that what I was feeling was just proximity, familiarity, just the natural result of spending a lot of time with someone you trust. He paused. I got very good at explaining it away. She kept moving, the floor under her feet, the band, his hand at her waist. Mason, I'm not saying this to put pressure on anything, he said. He looked at her now. I'm tired of explaining it away. That's all I'm saying. She held his gaze. Around them, other couples moved in their own quiet orbits, indifferent to the specific weight of this particular 4 square feet of dance floor. Can I ask you something? She said. Yeah. When you think about... She stopped, started again. When you imagine what the future looks like, not specifically, not a plan, just the general shape of it. She took a breath. Am I in it? It was the question she'd been carrying in one form or another for 3 years. The one she'd only ever said out loud to Diane in the privacy of a phone call she thought had ended. Saying it to his face, in a room full of people, while he was holding her, felt like standing at the edge of something very high with her eyes open. He didn't answer immediately. She felt him slow slightly, the dancing becoming almost still, a slight withdrawal from the rhythm. His hand at her waist didn't move. He was just looking at her with that particular look that meant the controlled surface of him was operating at capacity. Yes, he said, you're in all of it. You've been in all of it for, I don't even know how long. A beat. Every woman I ever met, every time I tried to imagine something with someone else, there was always this. He made a slight motion with his head that she understood to mean you, always you. I stopped dating seriously 2 years ago. I told myself it was because of Lily, because of timing, and Lily was part of it, but she wasn't all of it. The band transitioned, barely perceptible, one slow song folding into the next. I was already gone, he said. I just didn't let myself say it. Victoria stood in the middle of a wedding dance floor in her bare feet and felt something she'd been holding for years release its grip on her sternum. Not dramatically, not the way it happened in movies with a rush of music and clarity, just a slow, profound easing, like a breath she'd been holding so long she'd forgotten what breathing normally felt like. Her eyes were doing something she would later deny. I need you to understand, she said, keeping her voice even, that I've been carrying this for a very long time, and I spent most of that time convinced I was being, she searched for the word, strategically patient, protecting something. And now I think I was also just scared, and I'm still scared. I want to be clear about that. I'm standing here, and I'm terrified. I know, he said. Me too. But I'm more tired of being careful about this than I am afraid of what happens if we stop being careful. She looked at him for a long moment. Outside, through the French doors, the garden was lit with small lights strung between old trees, the kind of light that turns everything it touches slightly golden. Victoria had noticed it when they arrived and filed it under irrelevant. It didn't feel irrelevant now. "Can we—" she started. "The doors." He understood. He took her hand, not the careful, tentative way from the park bench, but directly with purpose, and led them off the floor and through the open French doors into the garden. The night was cooler out here, and the music came through muffled, still present, but at a distance. The lights in the trees threw soft patterns on the stone path. Somewhere across the garden, two other guests were having a quiet conversation near the far hedge, too far to hear. Victoria stood on the stone path and looked up at the lights and pulled in a long breath of night air. Mason stood beside her. He hadn't let go of her hand. 9 years, she said. 9 years, he agreed. We are both incredibly stubborn people. Objectively, yes. She laughed, a real one, sudden and slightly wet around the edges in a way she was going to blame on the wine later. She turned toward him. He was already turned toward her, which she'd half known without looking. I don't want to do another 9 years of this, she said. Neither do I. I need you to actually mean that. Not in the moment, not because it's a wedding and there are string lights and I'm apparently... She gestured at herself. I need you to mean it when it's a Tuesday and Lily has a stomach bug and the dishwasher's broken and we're both exhausted and there's nothing romantic about any of it. I mean it on Tuesdays, he said. I've meant it on Tuesdays for years. That's sort of the problem. She looked at him. The lights. His face, which she knew as well as she knew her own apartment. Better, maybe. When he closed the distance between them, it wasn't fast. It was the deliberate movement of someone who has decided. She met him halfway, because she'd already decided too, some version of this decision made years ago and remade every day since. The kiss was not what either of them might have choreographed if they'd been constructing it in theory. It was slightly off-center at first, a small adjustment, her hand coming up to his jacket lapel, not from a script, but from the need to hold on to something. It was warm and present and carried the full weight of every conversation they'd had and everyone they'd been afraid to have. When they separated, neither of them moved far. Okay, Victoria said, her voice lower than usual. Okay, Mason said. They stood in the garden under the lights while the muffled music continued through the stone walls, and neither of them said anything for a while because nothing else needed to be said right now. The night was cool. His hand was still in hers. Somewhere inside, Renata and Paul were dancing on their wedding night, perfectly happy, the dropped ring already a story worth telling. Out here, something else had just become a story worth telling. Victoria rested her head against his shoulder the way she'd been carefully not doing for most of 9 years. His arm came around her, not tentatively, like it had always been meant to go there and had simply been waiting for someone to stop moving it away. The garden held the quiet around them. Above, the string lights held their small gold shapes against the dark. Nothing was resolved. Nothing was simple. There was Lily to think about, and the friendship they'd built that would have to be rebuilt as something else, and every practical, complicated question that came with changing the fundamental structure of the life you'd made with someone. But right now, in this garden, none of that was yet. Right now, there was just the two of them, standing still at the end of something and the beginning of something else, and the long overdue relief of not having to pretend. Victoria closed her eyes. She thought, this is what I was afraid of losing. And then, quieter, underneath, I can't believe I almost kept it from myself. Mason stood with his arm around her and looked at the lights in the trees and didn't think in words. He just stayed, present and still and exactly where he was, no part of him reaching for an exit. After a while, music changed. A louder song started up inside, breaking the mood enough that other voices began drifting from the direction of the French doors. Guests migrating, the reception reaching its later, looser hour. Victoria lifted her head. We should probably go back in, she said. Renata will notice. Carol definitely already knows. Carol knew when I walked in the door. She straightened up, not pulling away, just adjusting. She's going to say something unbearable. I can handle Carol. You have no idea what you're agreeing to. Probably not, he said. He looked at her. Something easy in his face now, the strain of the last several days finally let go. But I'll figure it out. She looked at him a moment longer. Then she took his hand again, different from the bench. Not cautious, not exploratory, just the straightforward fact of it. They went back inside. Carol, who was standing near the bar with a glass of something and an expression of elaborate innocence, caught Victoria's eye across the room and raised her glass a fraction of an inch. Victoria looked away and didn't smile. She smiled when Carol couldn't see it. The drive home from the wedding was quiet in the way that comes after something significant. Not uncomfortable, not strained, just full. Like a room after music stops, the silence still holding the shape of the sound. Mason drove. Victoria sat in the passenger seat with her heels back on and her window down 2 inches, the cool night air moving through the gap. Neither of them had said much since leaving the venue. They'd said goodbye to Renata, who had hugged Victoria for a long time, and whispered something Mason couldn't hear that made Victoria pull back and give her a look that was half warning and half something softer. They'd navigated the parking lot and the highway on-ramp in the first 20 minutes of the drive without needing to fill it. It wasn't avoidance. It was something closer to the careful way you carry a full glass, deliberately, because you don't want to spill any of it. He pulled up outside her building at 11:40, left the engine running. She didn't move immediately, which was its own kind of answer. "Do you want to come up?" she said. "I have coffee." "It's almost midnight." "I'm aware of what time it is, Mason." He turned off the engine. They sat at her kitchen table with coffee neither of them particularly needed, and they talked. Not about the garden or the kiss, not directly. They talked around the edges of it the way two careful people do when they've just crossed a line they can't uncross and are still figuring out what the new territory looks like. They talked about Renata and Paul and the dropped ring. They talked about Carol, who had apparently told Victoria's mother about Mason before the car cleared the parking lot, which meant Victoria would be getting a call in the morning. This produced a brief, complicated look on Victoria's face that Mason had never seen before. "Is that bad?" he asked. "My mother will be—" She paused. "She'll be enthusiastic. Is that bad?" "She's been telling me for 4 years to say something." Victoria wrapped both hands around her mug. "She's going to be very restrained about being right, and it's going to be agonizing." "I like your mother. You've met her twice. She's direct, and she doesn't pretend things are fine when they aren't. I like her." Victoria looked at him across the table. "She's going to ask when you're coming to dinner." "Okay. This week. She's going to ask if you can come this week." "Can I?" Something shifted in her expression, not dramatically, just that quiet internal adjustment he was learning to watch for. "You're not scared of any of this," she said. Not an accusation, more like she was identifying something she hadn't expected. "I'm scared of plenty of it," he said. "I'm just not scared of your mother." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I need to tell you something. And I need you to hear it without fixing it. Just hear it." He set down his cup. "Okay." She looked at the table, not avoiding him, just finding the right arrangement of words. "I've spent a long time being the person who has everything handled," she said. "The business, the reputation, the whole exterior of it. And I worked hard for that, and I don't regret it. But somewhere in building all of that, I got very good at managing how much people could see." She looked up. "With you, it was different. It was always different. You're the only person I've genuinely not been able to manage. And that's—" She exhaled. "That's why it took so long. Because I couldn't control how this felt, and I couldn't figure out how to move forward without being able to control it." Mason listened. He didn't say anything. "I'm telling you this because if we're going to do this properly, and I want to do this properly, I'm not interested in halfway, then I need you to know that I'm going to be bad at it sometimes. Not at caring about you, at the vulnerability, at asking for things instead of just handling them, at letting you see the parts I've been keeping out of frame." She looked at her cup. "I wanted to say that now, before we're in the middle of it and it becomes a thing." He sat with that for a moment. "You've let me see you cry twice," he said. "That's different. You called me at 1 in the morning when the Mercer account almost fell apart 2 years ago and stayed on the phone for 2 hours because you didn't want to be alone with it. That's—" You sat on my kitchen floor with Lily when she was sick last winter, and you stayed until 3 in the morning even though you had a board presentation the next day. He looked at her. Victoria, I've already seen you, not the managed version. I've seen the real one. For a long time. A pause. You're not as sealed off as you think you are. Not with me. She was quiet. I know that, she said finally, at a lower register. I think that's actually what scares me most. Being seen? Being seen by you, specifically. She turned the cup. Because your opinion of me is... She stopped. It matters to me more than almost anything. And there's a version of this where I let you all the way in and you see something you didn't bargain for and I lose... She couldn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. He knew what she was going to say. He leaned forward slightly, both forearms on the table. I've known you for 9 years, he said. I've seen you manage a hostile client takeover, and I've seen you eat cereal at my kitchen counter at 7 in the morning without your contacts in, and I've seen you cry at a nature documentary about elephant families, which you made me promise not to mention. I'm asking you. I've seen all of it. The capable version and the tired version, and the version that gets genuinely furious about small injustices in ways that are completely disproportionate and also entirely correct. He held her gaze. There is no version of you I haven't already decided was worth it. She looked at him for a long moment. The elephant documentary? I will never speak of it again. She laughed, a short, real, slightly undone sound. She pressed the back of her hand against her mouth for a second. Then she dropped it and just looked at him, unguarded in a way she rarely was. All the composition of the evening slightly loosened. Okay, she said. Okay? Okay. She nodded. I hear you. It wasn't a declaration of perfect trust. It wasn't a clean resolution. It was Victoria Langford agreeing to try, which anyone who knew her understood was not a small thing. She didn't try at things she wasn't willing to commit to. She didn't commit to things she didn't believe in. The word okay from her, said in that specific voice, carried more weight than most speeches. Mason understood this. He picked up his coffee. They stayed at that kitchen table until nearly 1 in the morning. The days that followed were not cinematic. That was the thing nobody warned you about. That the beginning of something real looked a lot like ordinary life. Tuesday was still Tuesday. Mason still had the Creston project. Victoria still had 43 employees and a Q3 review coming up. Lily still had homework and opinions about horse legs and a complicated relationship with any vegetable that wasn't a carrot. They saw each other the following Saturday. He brought Lily because Lily had specifically requested to see Victoria, citing the unresolved issue of the horse's tail, which she had now decided was actually wrong and required a second opinion. Victoria had cleared her afternoon. They spent 3 hours at her apartment, Lily drawing at the coffee table, Mason reading something work-adjacent on the couch, Victoria alternating between her own laptop and the drawing consultations that Lily required at regular intervals. At one point, Mason looked up and found Victoria cross-legged on the floor beside Lily, both of them bent over the drawing, Victoria saying something that made Lily dissolve into giggles and then immediately try to recover her seriousness. He watched them for a moment without either of them noticing. He thought, there it is. The uncurated version, the real thing. He looked back down at his reading. Later, after Lily had fallen asleep on Victoria's couch under a throw blanket, which had not been the plan but had happened the way things with children always happen, completely outside the plan, Mason and Victoria sat in the kitchen with the lights low and talked quietly the way you do when there's a small person sleeping in the next room. She asked me last week, Mason said, what it would be like if you were her mom. Victoria looked up from her tea. Not in a... He paused. Not charged. She was just asking, the way she asks things, like she's running a calculation. What did you say? I said I didn't know. I told her things were still figuring themselves out. He looked at his cup. She thought about that for a second and then said that seemed slow, and then went back to her drawing. Victoria set down her mug. Her expression was doing several things at once. She's not wrong, she said, about it being slow. No, she's not. He looked at her. I'm not telling you that to pressure you, or to put that whole weight on a conversation a 6-year-old had in passing. I'm telling you because she's part of this. She's the biggest part of this, and I don't want to be managing that information separately from the rest of it. Victoria nodded. She was very still in the way that meant she was thinking carefully. I don't want to be a weekend presence to her, she said. I need you to know that. I'm not interested in being the nice lady who shows up and makes things fun and then leaves. If I'm in all the way. That's just how I am. I know. And that means, she exhaled, that means I'm going to make mistakes. With her. I don't know how to be a parent. I haven't done this. And I'm going to get things wrong, and I'll need you to tell me when I do without making me feel like I'm failing. Same back, he said. She looked at him. I've been parenting alone for 5 years, he said. I've got habits and systems and ways of doing things that are probably... He paused. Some of them are probably walls I built without realizing, and you're going to bump into them, and I need you to tell me that too. She considered him for a long moment. We're negotiating. We're being honest. At 1 a.m. in my kitchen while your daughter sleeps on my couch. The corner of her mouth moved. This is not how I pictured this conversation. What did you picture? Something with more time to prepare. She looked at the table. I pictured being ready. Are you not ready? She thought about it. Actually thought about it. Not the quick-managed version. I'm ready, she said. I'm just also scared. Both things are true. Yeah, he said. Same. So the first real difficulty came 3 weeks later, and it came, as difficulties usually do, from a direction neither of them was watching. His name was Daniel Forrest, and he was a VP at one of Victoria's competitor firms. He'd been leaving messages for 2 weeks, professionally appropriate messages, business context that was real. But the messages had a secondary texture that Victoria recognized and had been choosing not to name. Daniel was attractive and successful and had made it fairly clear, in the careful language of professional adjacency, that he was interested in something beyond the business conversation. She hadn't mentioned him to Mason, not because she was hiding anything, because nothing had happened and she'd been handling it herself, and mentioning it felt complicated, like introducing a variable into something still new and slightly fragile. The problem was that Mason found out sideways. A mutual professional acquaintance, a woman named Priya, who moved in overlapping circles, mentioned it to Mason in passing at an industry event. Something offhand, genuinely innocent. I heard Daniel Forrest has been calling Victoria's office. He seems interested, said with the light, informational tone of someone sharing mild gossip, with no idea it landed like something thrown hard. Mason had kept his face neutral, said something inconsequential, and then driven home feeling something he didn't like feeling because it was small and it was his and it was sitting in his chest in a way that made him aware of it every time he breathed. It wasn't jealousy. Or it was, but not the dramatic kind. Not possessive, not irrational. It was quieter and more uncomfortable than that. It was the realization that he didn't know about it, that Victoria had known something that touched on them, on this thing they were building, and hadn't told him. And that in the space of that not telling, his imagination had filled the gap with something that felt worse than whatever the truth was. He didn't say anything that night. He sat with it. He said something the next evening, when they were on the phone, and he heard himself say it before he'd fully decided to. Priya mentioned Daniel Forrest. A pause. Short, but there. Okay, Victoria said. Okay? Okay, yes, he's been calling. It's a professional matter with a personal undertone that I've been managing. You didn't mention it. Because there was nothing to mention. I haven't returned the calls beyond professional necessity. There's no... Victoria... He stopped. Made himself say the actual thing rather than the careful version of it. I'm not accusing you of anything. I'm telling you that I found out sideways and it bothered me. Not because of him. Because I didn't know. Because you didn't tell me. Silence on the line. The specific kind that means the other person is sitting with something they'd rather not sit with. You're right, she said. Not immediately, but not slowly either. I should have told you. Why didn't you? She took a moment. Because I didn't want to introduce something uncertain into something we're still building. Because it felt like... She paused. Like, if I mentioned it, it would become a thing. And it wasn't a thing. It still would have been better to know. Yes. A beat. I know. I was managing it instead of talking about it, which is, she exhaled, which is exactly what I told you I was going to be bad at. He sat with that. I'm not angry, he said. I know, you're worse than angry. You're quietly disappointed, which I would actually prefer not to experience again. I'm not disappointed in you, He tried to find the right word. I'm adjusting to the fact that this is new and we're both going to get things wrong, and this is apparently one of the ways you'll get things wrong. And one of the ways you'll get things wrong? He thought about it. Probably going quiet when I should say something. Going interior. Making you guess what I'm thinking when I should just say it. Yes, she said. That. A pause. Are we fighting right now? I don't think so. I think we're talking. Okay. She exhaled slowly. Okay, I'll handle Forrest directly this week, and I'll stop managing things sideways. I'll tell you. That's all I needed. You also needed to say something instead of sitting on it. He acknowledged that. Fair. The silence that followed was different from the difficult one that had opened the conversation. It was the kind that comes after two people have said the hard thing and survived it. We're going to be bad at this sometimes, Victoria said. Yeah, but we're going to say so. That's the deal, he said. She made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. The deal. Very romantic. I think it is, actually. Another pause. Mason? Yeah. I don't want Daniel Forrest. I don't want anyone else. I want you to know that clearly and not just implied. She said it plainly, the way she said things when she decided they needed to be said. I've wanted you for years and now I have you, and the last thing I want is to blow it because I forgot to talk to you about something that didn't matter. He was quiet for a moment. The city was doing its night sounds outside his window. Down the hall, Lily had been asleep for 2 hours. I know, he said. I know that. But it's better said. It's better said. They stayed on the phone another half hour. By the end of it, the shape of the evening had changed from the hard edges of the beginning to something easier. Not repaired. It hadn't been broken, just tested and found to hold. That was the thing about building something real between two people who had spent years being careful about exactly this. Every difficulty was also a kind of data. Proof that they could move through something without losing each other. Proof that the friendship underneath could handle the weight of what they were putting on top of it. Lily found out in the way children find out about things. Not because anyone sat her down and explained it, but because she was watching, and children who are watchers see everything before you think they do. It was a Sunday, 3 weeks after the wedding, and the three of them were at the park, the one with the eastern fountain, which had by this point accumulated more weight than any public park fountain reasonably should. Lily was running ahead on the path with the focused energy of someone with a precise destination in mind, and Mason and Victoria were walking behind her at the unhurried pace of people who had discovered that walking next to each other required no conversation to justify it. At some point, Victoria took his hand. Not dramatically. Just took it, the way she had in the garden, because it was there, and it was his, and because not taking it required more effort than taking it did. Lily turned around, checking that they were still following, which she did every 30 seconds with the diligence of a small shepherd, and saw. She stopped. She looked at their joined hands with an expression of profound assessment. Then she looked at Mason, then at Victoria, then at their hands again. Are you guys boyfriend and girlfriend? She asked. The directness of it landed like a small, clean stone dropped into water. Mason looked at Victoria. Victoria looked at Mason. We're figuring that out, Mason said. Lily considered this. But you're holding hands. Yes. So you like each other? Yes. Then you're boyfriend and girlfriend. She said it with the authority of someone for whom the logic was airtight. That's how it works. Victoria made a sound that she covered quickly, but Mason caught, something between laughter and something more complicated. That is roughly how it works, Victoria said. Lily looked at her for a moment. Then, with the abrupt topic change of the very young, she said, Can we get the thing from the cart? The orange one? The popsicle? Mason said. The orange one. Yeah, he said. We can get the orange one. She turned and ran toward the cart, already past it, already moving on to the next thing with the efficiency of someone who had gotten the information she needed and filed it appropriately. Mason watched her go. Victoria's hand was still in his. He could feel her shoulder shaking slightly, the suppressed version of a laugh, which was also possibly something else. She's going to be fine, Victoria said. I know. She was already fine. She was ahead of us before we got there. She's been ahead of us the whole time, he said. They walked toward the cart. The afternoon was doing something pleasant with the light, the way late-day sun does in certain seasons when it comes in at an angle that makes everything look slightly better than it is. Lily was already in the cart, standing on her toes, pointing at the orange one. Victoria leaned into his shoulder slightly as they walked. Mason held her hand and didn't explain it and didn't qualify it. It was the first moment he could remember in a long time where he wasn't managing anything. Not the future, not the fear, not the questions that didn't have answers yet. Just the path and the fountain and his daughter at the cart and the person beside him who had somehow been the whole shape of the answer before he'd learned to ask the question properly. It wasn't perfect. None of it was close to perfect. But it was honest. It was mutual. And it was, for the first time in years, entirely unafraid of itself. The first year was not a love story in the way people mean when they say that. It was not soft lighting and seamless transitions. It was two people who had spent nearly a decade being one thing to each other, learning, with varying degrees of grace, how to be something else. It was adjustment and misreading, and the specific friction that comes when you take a friendship built on a certain kind of safety and ask it to carry more weight than it was originally designed for. There were good weeks, and there were weeks that weren't. There was the week in February when Mason's project went into crisis. 3 simultaneous client escalations, a junior team member who quit without notice, and a Thursday night where he didn't come home until 10 and didn't call until 9:45. And Victoria had been at his apartment with Lily because Rosa had a conflict, and she'd handled the dinner and the bedtime and the reading of the specific dinosaur book that Lily required read in a specific voice. And by the time Mason walked in the door, she was sitting on the couch with the particular stillness that meant she was managing something. He'd known immediately. I should have called earlier. You should have, she said. Not an explosion, just the plain fact of it. I was in it. I lost track. I know you were in it. I understand that. She looked at him. But I didn't know where you were. I had Lily, and I didn't know what was happening, and I sat here running through scenarios, and... She stopped. I needed you to call, that's all. He'd sat down. You're right. I'm sorry. She'd nodded. And then, because she'd promised herself she would say the true thing instead of managing it. It scared me. Not knowing. I'm still learning what my role is in a crisis you're having. I don't know when to push and when to wait. And tonight I didn't know if you were okay, and I couldn't ask Lily because she's 6, and I didn't want to worry her, so I just... She exhaled, sat here. I'm sorry, he said again. This time without the explanation attached. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she moved over on the couch, and he sat beside her, and she leaned into his shoulder the way she'd learned she was allowed to, and they sat like that without resolving anything formally, just being in the same space at the end of a hard day, which was sometimes the whole of what was needed. They got better at it, slowly, not in a straight line. There was the Saturday in April where Lily had a stomach bug and was miserable and clingy and wanted Mason specifically with the exclusive intensity that sick children reserve for the primary parent. Victoria had understood this, but she knew, intellectually, that there would be times when Lily's need for her father would leave no room for anyone else. And that was not rejection, it was just what it was. But understanding something intellectually and sitting in the hallway of an apartment listening to a child call for the parent who wasn't her was a different experience, and she'd ended up going home early with a quiet, "Let me know how she is," that came out slightly more clipped than she'd intended. Mason had called her that night, after Lily was finally asleep. "You okay?" he said. "Yes." A pause. "No, I felt..." She tried to find the honest word. "Peripheral. And I know that's not reasonable. She was sick and she needed you. I know that." "It's reasonable," he said. "You're allowed to feel peripheral without it being a crisis." I don't want to be peripheral. You're not. Today was a sick kid day. They're different. He was quiet for a second. You stayed until noon. You made her the soup thing she likes. You sat with her for 2 hours before she passed out. She asked for me because I'm her dad, and she was miserable. That's not a statement about where you stand. It's a 6-year-old with a fever. She'd been quiet. Victoria, you're not peripheral. You're becoming her person. That just takes time. How much time? I don't know. It's not a schedule. He paused. But I've watched her with you. I've been watching it for a year. It's happening. She'd stayed on the phone for another hour. By the end of it, the feeling had not disappeared completely, but it had been named, and named things are always more manageable than unnamed ones. That was the year. 2 steps forward and 1 step back, and the occasional stumble that required a full stop and a proper conversation. They had those conversations. That was the thing that mattered most, looking back. They had them when they were inconvenient, when both of them were tired, when neither of them wanted to be the one to say the hard thing. They'd made a deal on the night after the wedding, and they kept it, imperfectly and repeatedly, and with the kind of effort that doesn't look like effort from the outside, but costs something real from the inside. By summer, Lily had stopped asking whether Victoria was coming over and started assuming she was. By August, she had assigned Victoria a specific mug, the blue one with the small chip on the handle that was nonetheless her favorite, and had been allocated without ceremony or announcement one Sunday morning when Victoria had reached for a different one, and Lily had said, with complete authority, "That one's yours." Victoria had looked at Mason. Mason had looked at the mug. Neither of them had said anything about it afterward, but Mason had noticed that the blue mug was always in the front of the cabinet after that, ready. By the end of the first year, the shape of things had changed in ways that were difficult to pinpoint precisely because they'd happened gradually. Victoria knew where the spare blankets were, and which drawer held the batteries, and what Lily's teacher's name was, and exactly how Mason took his coffee on mornings when he was stressed versus mornings when he wasn't. Mason knew which meetings drained Victoria, and which ones energized her, and when her silence meant she needed space versus when it meant she needed someone to ask. They'd stopped performing for each other in the small ways people perform when they're still establishing trust, still checking whether the ground would hold. The ground held. Not because it was perfect, because they kept repairing it when it cracked. That was the whole of it. That was the only real secret, if there was one. The second year was quieter and more ordinary and, in many ways, more important than the first. Victoria's lease came up in March. She mentioned it to Mason on a Tuesday evening, casually, the same careful casualness she'd used to mention the wedding invitation 18 months ago. "Lease is up in 60 days, need to figure out the renewal." Mason had looked at her over the rim of his coffee cup for a moment. "Or," he said. She looked back at him. "Or," she agreed. They had the conversation properly that weekend, not with the casual shorthand, but the full version. What it would mean practically, logistically, emotionally, the concerns that needed to be named before they could be set aside. Victoria had a long-running system for her workspace, a separate home office she used for early mornings and late-night work sessions when she needed quiet. Mason's apartment would need to accommodate that. Lily would need to be talked to, properly, not just informed. "She's going to lose her mind," Mason said. "Probably. In a good way." "I know, but we still tell her properly. We don't spring it." He agreed. They told Lily on a Saturday afternoon, sitting at the kitchen table with the remnants of lunch still around them. Mason had said, "You know how Victoria has her own apartment?" Lily had looked at him with the expression of someone who has been waiting for a particular sentence for quite some time. "She's going to come live with us." Lily had been quiet for exactly 3 seconds. Then she'd gotten off her chair, walked around the table to Victoria, and put both arms around her waist with the firm, total commitment of a 7-year-old who has decided something is good and requires no further analysis. Victoria had looked at Mason over the top of Lily's head. Her eyes were doing the thing they did at the wedding, which he was now fluent in. He'd looked at his kid and the woman his kid was holding on to, and thought about everything he'd built in this apartment alone. The routines and the workarounds and the specific sadness of a life that was full and still somehow shaped by absence, and felt it rearrange itself. not disappear, rearrange, like the same materials assembled into something that finally fit. The move took 2 weekends and was chaotic in the way moves always are, underestimated and overcomplicated, involving a bookshelf that refused to go through the hallway at any angle, and a box labeled miscellaneous that turned out to contain 17 things that needed their own category. Victoria was methodical about her own things, and slightly horrified by the organizational system of Mason's kitchen cabinets, which she began addressing on day 2 with the contained focus of someone who considers this a professional obligation. "You have 3 can openers," she said, holding them up. "There might be a reason." "There is no reason. There has never been a reason." He took 2 of the can openers without comment and put them in the donation box. She watched him. "You didn't argue." "I've learned." "You've barely learned." "I'm learning." She put the remaining can opener in the correct drawer and moved on. Mason stood in his kitchen watching her move through the space with the focus and mild irritation of someone reorganizing a system that offends her, and thought, this is what it looks like. Not the version he'd been afraid to want, some idealized, composed picture. This, can openers and mismatched boxes and her knowing exactly where things should go and being mildly exasperated that they weren't already there. This was what he'd been standing with his back to for 9 years. He thought, standing there, that the saddest thing about fear is not what it protects you from. It's what it keeps you from having. And you don't always know what you've been missing until the day you stop turning away and look directly at it and find it looking back at you, entirely patient, still there. But by the time the second year finished, they had built something that had its own particular texture. Sunday mornings remained. They were different now, like noisier, more contested for counter space, Lily more present in them. The coffee taking longer because Victoria had opinions about the ratio that she'd been right about from the beginning. Mason conceded this around month 3 of cohabitation and never mentioned it again. They argued. Not often, but when they did, it was real. The kind of argument that comes from 2 people who know each other well enough to hit the actual thing instead of the surface. They'd learned, over time, the difference between an argument that needed to finish that night and one that needed to be slept on. They got it wrong sometimes. They were getting it wrong less. Lily grew. She was 8 by the time the second year ended, taller, more articulate, increasingly opinionated about everything from breakfast to whether her school's reading list was appropriately diverse. She had Mason's jaw and Victoria's directness, and the specific combination of those 2 things was something teachers mentioned at parent-teacher conferences with expressions that contained both admiration and mild apprehension. Victoria attended the parent-teacher conferences. The first time, she'd sat beside Mason in the small plastic chair that was designed for someone considerably shorter and listened to Lily's teacher describe Lily's strengths and areas for growth. And she'd ask questions that were incisive and practical and that Mason could not have formulated because he was too close to it. On the walk back to the car, Mason had said, "You were good in there. I just asked what needed asking. You saw it from the outside. I needed that." She'd looked at him. "I'll always do that, if you let me." "I'm letting you," he said. "I've been letting you." She'd taken his hand on the parking lot asphalt, and they'd driven home to find Lily with Rosa, who was 19 now and in her second year of college and still their most reliable person in a crisis. The proposal was not planned. That was the thing Mason would say later when people asked, and they always asked, because people love the architecture of a proposal, the evidence of intention and staging. He would say, "It wasn't planned," and they'd look at him like that was incomplete, like there had to be more to it. But it was just the truth. He hadn't planned it. It was a Thursday evening in October, the second October of them living together. Lily was asleep. The apartment was quiet in that specific late evening way, the city doing its low-level background work outside the windows, the kitchen clean, the lamp in the living room doing something warm with the corner it was in. Victoria was on the couch with her laptop, going through something from work with the focused frown she wore when the numbers weren't saying what she needed them to say. She had her hair down. She almost never had her hair down. It was always up for work, for going out, for anything that required presentation. And she was wearing one of his old university sweatshirts that had migrated into her possession so long ago that its original ownership was no longer a live question. Mason was in the armchair across from her with a book he hadn't been reading for the last 20 minutes because he'd been watching her instead. Not in a dramatic way, just the way you look at something you've stopped taking for granted. He thought about the night in his hallway with the call that hadn't ended. He thought about the park bench and the coffee shop and the wedding garden. He thought about the can openers and the blue mug and the parent-teacher conference and every hard conversation they'd had in 2 years that they'd come out the other side of. He thought about Lily calling for him on the sick day and Victoria sitting quietly in the hall and calling him that night and telling him honestly that she'd felt peripheral and the way that honesty had mattered more than any managed version of it would have. He thought about the version of himself that had stood in that hallway with his back carefully turned to the most obvious thing in his life for years, and felt something between amusement and tenderness toward that version. It had made sense at the time. It just hadn't been true. He put the book down. Victoria. She looked up from the laptop, registered his expression, whatever it was, and tilted her head slightly. What? He didn't have a speech. He hadn't prepared one. He'd thought about this in a vague, future-tense way for months, but he'd never put it in sequence, never arranged it. What he had was the simple thing, the true thing, the only version that felt right for two people who had made a deal about honesty. I don't want a future that doesn't have you in it, he said. Not because you're good for me, not because it makes sense, though both of those things are true, but because I spent years imagining what the future looked like, and you were already in every version of it before I let myself admit it. And I'm done imagining. He paused. I want you to marry me, not because it's the next step, because you're who I want to be next to. Victoria had gone very still. Her laptop was still open. The numbers were still not saying what she needed them to say. Neither of those things mattered anymore. She looked at him for a long moment with the full weight of someone who is deciding whether the thing in front of them is real. Not because they doubt it, but because they've wanted it long enough that the moment of it arriving required verification. You don't have a ring, she said. I know. You didn't plan this. No. You're proposing from an armchair. I am. She looked at him. Something moved through her expression. The whole long history of it, 9 years and a phone call and a park bench and a wedding garden and 2 years of the ordinary difficult work of building something real. All of it moving through her face in the space of a few seconds. Yes, she said. Not of course, that would have been too easy, too performed. Just yes. The plain word, said plainly, which was how she said things when they were true. He crossed the room and sat beside her on the couch, and she closed the laptop, and they stayed there for a long time without needing to fill it with anything more than what it already was. Later, much later, after the ring had been chosen together on a Saturday, when Lily had insisted on coming and had strong opinions about the settings, and turned out to have genuinely good taste, Mason would think about the word yes and the particular way she'd said it. Not performed, not relieved, just certain. The way she was about things, she'd already decided. She'd already decided, long before he asked, the same way he had. They just needed to stop being afraid at the same time. Well, the wedding was small by the standards of what Victoria could have planned if she'd applied her professional capacity to it. She could have organized something extraordinary. She had the contacts, the vision, the relentless logistical competence. She'd made a deliberate choice not to. 60 people. The venue, a restored building with good bones and real light. Lily as flower girl, a role she'd accepted with the gravity of someone given a serious professional assignment. Lily had taken it seriously. She'd practiced the walk. She'd had opinions about her dress, a pale sage that had been her first choice and everyone else's third, and she'd been right about it, which she'd noted without excessive satisfaction. On the morning of the wedding, she'd been composed in a way that was slightly unnerving for 8 years old, moving through the getting ready process with a calm that made Mason suspect she'd rehearsed this in her head many times. Victoria had gotten ready with her mother and her cousin Renata, who was 4 months pregnant and had cried twice before the ceremony started. Carol was there. Carol was always there. In the front row, with an expression of I told you so satisfaction, so complete it had become its own kind of affection. Mason stood at the end of the aisle in a suit that fit correctly, because Victoria had taken him to be properly measured, which had been its own quietly funny afternoon. He stood with his best man, an old college friend named Trevor, who had given a speech the night before that was approximately 30% roast and 70% genuine, which was the right ratio. He watched Lily come down the aisle first. She walked with complete seriousness, the basket of petals distributed with precise, controlled intervals, eyes forward. When she reached the front, she took her position beside him, looked up, and said in a voice that carried slightly more than she'd intended, "You're nervous." "A little." "Don't be," she said. "She's been ready forever." He looked at his daughter, 8 years old, sage dress, the quiet certainty that had always been the best of both of them. And something settled in his chest so completely it felt like the last piece of a thing clicking into place. Then the music changed. Victoria came down the aisle on her father's arm, and Mason saw her, and everything he'd been about to think dissolved into the simple fact of her. She was wearing something that was exactly right and completely her. Not the composed professional version or the defended private version, but something that held both and transcended both. Her hair was up with a few pieces loose, the way she never wore it normally, the way that made her look like herself, but more so. She was looking directly at him. Not at the room, not at the aisle, at him. Her eyes were bright, not the elegantly composed bright of a woman determined to hold it together. The genuinely overwhelmed bright of a woman who had spent years imagining something and was now walking toward the actual version of it. When she reached him, her father placed her hand in Mason's and stepped back, and she exhaled, a small, audible exhale, like setting down something heavy, and looked at him and almost smiled. "You're nervous," she said, quiet enough for only him. "Your daughter said the same thing." "Our daughter," she said. Simple, factual, like it had always been true. He held her hand. Thus, the vows were personal, which they'd both agreed on from the beginning. No borrowed language, no borrowed structure. The things they'd actually say. Mason went first. He held both her hands and looked at her and said, "I spent a long time being very good at not saying things. I told myself it was protection, protecting what we had, protecting Lily, protecting the life I'd built. And some of that was true. But most of it was just fear wearing responsible clothes." A breath. "The bravest thing I've ever done, other than raise our daughter, was stop explaining away what I felt about you and just say it. And I want to spend the rest of my life doing that. Not perfectly, not without getting it wrong, but honestly, every time." He paused. "I heard something once," he said, "that every future you imagined, I was already there." He felt her hands tighten slightly on his. "I need you to know that the same was true for me. Every version I let myself have, you were already in it. I just needed to be brave enough to stop turning away." She was holding it together with the effort of someone who had promised themselves they would not cry before they finished speaking. She did not entirely succeed. Her vows were shorter because she'd written them 3 times, and the third version had been the shortest and the most true, which was almost always how it worked. She said, "I decided a long time ago what I was willing to risk for you. I decided everything. And then I spent years not acting on it because I was afraid of getting the answer wrong. And then you heard a phone call." She laughed once, brief and wet. "And nothing went the way I planned, which is the most on-brand possible way for this to have happened." She steadied herself. "You are the only person I've ever been fully known by and fully chosen by in the same breath. And I intend to be that for you. Not the managed version, not the capable version, the whole one, for as long as you'll have it." She stopped. "Also," she said quieter, "I want to note for the record that I have excellent instincts, and this was always going to work out." The room laughed. Mason laughed. He was also, quietly, not entirely dry-eyed, which he would acknowledge to exactly one person later. Trevor, who would keep it to himself. He kissed her before the officiant quite finished, because he'd been waiting long enough, which got its own laugh from 60 people who had all, in some way, been waiting too. The reception was the kind that starts with intention and ends with shoes off, and Trevor doing something inadvisable on the dance floor. Carol danced with Lily. Victoria's mother held court at a corner table and cried periodically without apology. Renata and Paul were there, still radiantly happy, the dropped ring story now polished to its final form. At some point in the evening, Mason found himself standing at the edge of the room with a drink, watching. Victoria was on the dance floor with Lily. Not a slow song, something with more energy, and Lily was teaching Victoria a move that had no formal name and required significant commitment. Victoria was attempting it with the full force of her personality, which meant she was almost getting it and completely unbothered about the gap. Lily was laughing. Victoria was laughing at herself, which she'd gotten better at over 2 years of living with people who loved her enough to find her funny. Mason stood there and watched the two of them and felt something he had no precise word for. Not happiness. That was too thin for it. Not relief. That was too small. Something more like the specific, quiet satisfaction of a person who had been afraid of the right thing and walked toward it anyway and found on the other side that it was exactly what it had looked like from a distance. He thought about the person he'd been before Lily, the person he'd been after Danielle left. The years of building something careful and controlled and genuinely good, but small in a specific way. Small because he'd kept the edges managed, kept the risk contained, kept the most important things at a careful remove. He thought about all of it, and he thought, I understand why. And I'm glad that version of me is done. Victoria looked up from the dance floor at that moment, across the room, and found him standing there. She held his gaze for a second, a real look, the kind that doesn't need anything added to it. And then Lily pulled her attention back, and she went back to the unnamed dance move with full commitment. He stayed at the edge of the room a moment longer. Here is what he'd learned over 2 years of imperfect work. That love is not a feeling you fall into and then maintain. It is a choice you make repeatedly, in the ordinary moments, in the difficult ones, in the moments when fear comes back wearing a different coat and asks you to be careful again. Every time you choose to say the true thing instead of the managed thing. Every time you hold on when holding on costs something. Every time you look at the person beside you and decide again that this, imperfect and complicated and real, is what you want to build your life inside. He'd been afraid of disrupting the life he'd built for Lily. What he hadn't understood, what he'd needed 2 years to understand fully, was that he hadn't disrupted it. He'd finished it. He crossed the room and stepped onto the dance floor and found Victoria in the middle of it, Lily now diverted by Carol and a plate of desserts. He took Victoria's hand. She looked at him. What's the unnamed move? He asked. I don't know. Lily invented it. It involves this. She demonstrated. It required more hip than he had available. I can't do that. I know. I barely can. We can just, she agreed. They danced. The simple, unhurried version, the one that required nothing except being near each other. The band was playing something slow now, having read the room. Around them, other couples moved in their own orbits, indifferent to the specific fact of these two people and how long it had taken them to get here. Victoria leaned her head against his shoulder. His arm came around her. Do you remember, she said quietly, that I didn't know you'd heard when I made that call? I remember. I'd been carrying it for so long that saying it out loud felt like releasing pressure, just to Diane, in what I thought was private. I wasn't trying to force anything. I just needed to say it somewhere. I know. And then you heard anyway. She paused. I used to be embarrassed about that. The accidental way of it. Like it should have been more intentional, more chosen. Is that still how you feel? She was quiet for a moment. No, she said. I think it was exactly right, actually. The call that didn't end, the bench, the wedding, all the messy, unplanned pieces of it. She lifted her head from his shoulder and looked at him. I think if we'd had a clean, planned version, it wouldn't have been ours. He looked at her, his wife. The word was new and strange and completely accurate. Every future I imagined, he said. She smiled. The real one. The one that appeared when her guard was down and something actually landed. Every single one, she said. They stayed on the dance floor while the room moved around them, neither of them needing anything more than what this was. Outside, the city did its endless, indifferent work. Inside, 60 people who had gathered to witness something move through their own conversations and dances and private moments. At some point, Lily reappeared from the dessert table and wedged herself between them without ceremony, one arm around each of them, looking up with the expression of someone who has arrived exactly where she intended to be. "You're interrupting," Mason said. "I know," Lily said. She didn't move. Victoria looked down at her, then at Mason. Then she adjusted, making room, one arm around Lily's shoulders. The three of them stood there on the dance floor, slightly tangled, not especially graceful, entirely present. This was the whole of it, not the grand moment. Those had passed, and they'd been real, and they'd mattered. But this, the ordinary fact of the three of them in a room at the end of a day, belonging to each other, built slowly, chosen repeatedly, earned. There is a kind of love that announces itself loudly and burns fast and makes a tremendous amount of noise on its way out. And there is another kind, quieter, more persistent, the kind that grows in the spaces between ordinary days without being noticed until one day you look up and find it has become the whole architecture of your life. Mason Reed had spent years being afraid of disrupting what he had. What he hadn't known, what he'd needed to lose the fear to understand, was that the disruption was never the danger. The danger had always been the staying still, the careful management of the distance, the years of standing next to the truest thing in his life with his back politely turned. He was done turning away. He held his daughter and his wife in the middle of a dance floor, and the room moved around them, and the music moved around them, and the whole long future of it, imperfect and full and entirely theirs, stretched out ahead of them, ready. They stepped into it together.